Hey, today I wanted to talk about a very controversial subject, and that is abortion. I'll keep my opinion out of its start, and we'll look at it from a scientific and philosophical perspective first. Then we'll talk about it from a Christian point of view very briefly. Christians, this isn't as straightforward of an argument as you may think, so hear me out. You're going to get the Ben Shapiro treatment yet again today to keep me from rambling. Hopefully, this will be a relatively short video compared to my first one, which was far more philosophically involved. To start, let's look at the definition of life from a scientific point of view. From Wikipedia, life refers to matter that has biological processes defined descriptively by the capacity for homeostasis, organization, metabolism, growth, adaptation, response to stimuli, and reproduction. Now that we have a list of descriptors that define life, let's go through each one of these from easiest to hardest. 1. Growth. The moment the egg is fertilized, it becomes a zygote and begins to grow, rapidly dividing into multiple cells. 2. Organization. The DNA of the zygote is organized and the cells also quickly divide into two organized structures in less than a week. 3. Metabolism. The zygote uses nutrients stored in the egg and metabolizes this for energy and to provide material to build new structures. 4. Response to stimuli and adaptation. I'm going to combine these. The zygote responds to chemical signals. This includes chemical cues released by the mother that signal implantation, and also detection of albumin, which will result in the release of a compound to protect itself. The latter could also be seen as adaptation to a hostile environmental trigger. 5. Reproduction. This depends on your definition. The cell is reproducing at all times. However, in the sense of procreation, we can't use this as a limiting factor to our classification of fertilized eggs as living, since children also can't procreate. There are also people who are born incapable of procreating and they're still considered alive. 6. Homeostasis. The zygote is capable of homeostasis inside of the mother's body, including the ability to maintain ion concentrations, pH, osmotic balance, temperature, and its metabolic state as previously discussed. Now, I know the argument will be, well, it can't maintain homeostasis outside of the mother, but this is a moot point as many individuals are relying on drugs, oxygen tanks, or other apparatus to maintain homeostasis and stay alive. Now, some would still argue, based on the philosophical machination referred to as the concept of personhood, that the life of this new human being has no value. They would also argue, based on the idea of women's rights and bodily autonomy, that even if it is a living being, the woman should have the right to choose what she does with her body. So let's go through these arguments and see if there are any rational philosophical responses that can be given. Number 1, we're going to get this one out of the way quick. It's a stupid argument. It's just a clump of cells. Well, so are you. Don't cheapen your life. Number 2, but the mind isn't developed. It's not self-aware. It's not a person because it doesn't have any brain function. Philosophically, I have to question what you mean by developed mind or brain function, considering the disparate intelligence of humanity. Essentially, this boils down to a straight-up argument for eugenics. What I mean by that is, if we are to set qualifiers on perceived intelligence or self-awareness of an individual to what life is, who is to set the cutoff? We see in places like the US and EU, this type of argument has been used to justify abortion in cases of malformations or possibly physical or mental disabilities. It's kind of mask off at this point. It has also been argued to allow euthanasia of dementia patients who no longer properly function without aid. These eugenicist arguments are the exact same line of thinking that led the Nazis to believe that they were a superior race and used as an excuse to eradicate the Jews. Ironically, abortion itself partly finds its roots in eugenics. To quote Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who voted to allow abortions in the Roe v. Wade decision, "I had thought at the time that Roe was decided there was a concern about population growth, and particularly growth in populations that we don't want to have too many of." The dark undertone of this statement is abundantly clear. The reason some of the Supreme Court justices voted in favor of Roe v. Wade was based on their eugenicist beliefs, specifically against black populations in inner cities. Therefore, to avoid the slippery slope that has led to so many atrocities historically, the only way that we can rationally define a human life is by the scientifically agreed definition. And any termination of that life through intervention on the part of any individual should therefore constitute murder. Third argument. It's part of the mother, her body, her choice. No, as we previously discussed, it's attached to the mother. The zygote contains its own unique genetic code. Even with identical twins that share the same DNA, we would say that they are individuals, independent of one another, and this remains true for twins who are co-joined at birth, whether or not they are later surgically separated. Therefore, the zygote, which is attached to the mother, is its own individual. You cannot claim my body, my choice, when in fact it is another human's body, your choice. Now, this does lead into a moral conundrum when we consider matters where the mother was unwillingly forced to have intercourse with another individual, which we will discuss momentarily. But in cases where the mother made the responsible decision to participate in procreative activities that she knew could result in a new human life, even if by accident, say a broken condom or something like that, any termination of that life constitutes murder. Now let's discuss exceptions that are often made for abortion. If a woman is impregnated unwillingly, I'm not going to use the word because of YouTube, through any method, philosophically, it may seem hard to argue that the state should be allowed to force the mother to carry that child to term since it violates her bodily autonomy. However, we live in a heteronomous society. Laws are set by the state. Any autonomy you are granted can be taken away depending on the circumstances that we as a society agree to. For example, if you murder someone, you will likely be thrown into prison. In this case, we as a society exclusively agree that two wrongs do not make a right. That is, we agree that crimes do not balance each other out. Furthermore, we often see that the penalty for extreme crimes like murder is death. However, that only ever applies to the individuals who commit those crimes, not other parties that might be indirectly related to them. For example, you would not put parents of a child who commit murder to death, especially if their influence was unrelated to the action. To that end, as much as the mother was unwilling to be impregnated, so too is the child unwillingly brought into the world. Neither party is at fault and neither should be judged. Therefore, instead of permitting abortion, the father should be made to take on all expenses related to the mother's pregnancy, including the risk, say risk payment or something like that. And if the mother chooses to keep the child, he should also be forced to pay not only for child support related expenses, but also should be prepared to pay for any expenses related to the mother's part in raising the child, including her time. However, as this would likely be a rare outcome, the child would more likely be put up for adoption and the father should be forced to pay the state for all expenses related to them. 2. In cases where a mother's life is at risk, the argument often becomes, we do not want to end the life of the child, but we must save the life of the mother. Unfortunately, many have also argued that mental health is included under this rule, and as such, corrupt psychologists are able to prescribe abortions in circumstances where the mother might have otherwise been barred. I have to question if these same psychologists should also be qualified to prescribe the murder of other individuals who negatively affect the mental health of their patients. Obviously not. Therefore, this is an apparent perversion of the law, justified solely using a technical loophole in the letter of the law, and should be done away with altogether. In cases, however, where the child has cancer or AIDS or other conditions that could spread to the mother and result in her death, it should be recognized that pregnancy and giving birth, in general, have always had relatively high mortality rates. Risk aversion has never justified the murder of any individual, except in cases of self-defense, where the person is the likely intent to harm the other individual. Fetuses are not capable of this intent, and that is what distinguishes them in these cases. Furthermore, there have been many instances where women have received such negative reports, such as the baby has cancer or AIDS, and they did not come to fruition and the mother was perfectly fine. The child was born and treated without harm to the mother, and both continued on to live regular lives. Historically, we have seen cases where risk aversion was used as justification to target groups of individuals, such as the Japanese internment camps in America during World War II. This is still regarded as a dark period in American history, after which President Gerald Ford proclaimed that these incarcerations were a national mistake that should never be repeated again. Therefore, given the philosophical implications of allowing such an exemption to abortion based on risk aversion and the logical extension of this that could be used to justify all abortions, these arguments are obviously not tenable as an excuse for the termination of the life of an infant. As a side note, removal of a deceased infant from the room should not fall into this category. If the infant is already dead, then removal of the fetus will not constitute murder. That should be obvious, but I've heard people argue that this is what people are trying to make happen. Okay, lastly, one of the arguments made for abortion is that around 40 to 60% of zygotes are rejected naturally by the body of the mother. Nevertheless, even if life in the earliest stages is like a man walking on a tightrope at high altitude with a relatively high chance of failure, it would still be seen as murder if someone came and shoved that person off the tightrope during a performance. Therefore, this cannot be used as a philosophical justification for murder. Now that we've explored the scientific and philosophical arguments related to abortion, let's briefly see what the Bible says. Genesis 1:26-27. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." So God created man in his own image. So we are made in God's image. This is sacred. Psalm 139:13-16. For you created my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret, and skillfully wrought in the lowest places of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance, being yet unformed, and in your book they were all written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet were none of them. This indicates directly that God Himself is the one that forms each one of us by design and knows us before we are born. This is echoed in Jeremiah 1:5. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you. I ordained you to be a prophet to the nations. Not only does God know each one of us before we're born, we were all written into His book, and He has a plan for each one of us, a purpose. Even when the mother of the prophet John, Elizabeth, heard Mary coming as she had become pregnant with Jesus, John leapt for joy in his mother's womb, indicating an awareness that goes beyond what most proponents of abortion would willingly admit. With this information, we clearly see that God is deeply involved from the very inception of every person's life starting in the womb, and He has made each one of us in His sacred image for a purpose. As such, how could any Christian tolerate arguments for abortion? If God Himself identifies murder as wrong, and that life starts in the womb, what possible argument could justify it? It is time for the churches across the nation to speak out against these atrocities, which constitute the largest orchestrated genocide in the history of man being perpetrated both here in the United States and abroad. If we truly claim to value human life and defend the sacred image of God imprinted on each one of us, we must speak out. Anyway, thank you for your time. Have a blessed day.